Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Wednesday seminar. I am Behruz Qamari Tabrizi. I'm the director of Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. As always, I would like to begin by thanking Becky Parnian, our events coordinator, and Pete Novak, our technical guru here that makes both of them make these series possible and allow us to have a good and substantive conversation every week on different topics. The program is going to be 1 hour and we try to end it right at the hour mark. And I will introduce our speakers and then we have a short conversation after their presentation, and after which I would open the screen or the floor for questions from our audiences. You can submit your questions through the Q&A button on the at the bottom of your screen, and I would pose your written questions to our guests. Without further ado, let me introduce our author today, Amelie Le Renard, who is a permanent researcher at CNRS. For those of you who don't know, French National Center for Scientific Research. In her work, she focuses on gender studies, post-colonial feminism, and intersectionality. She's a sociologist, and she's the author of The Society of Young Women, Opportunities of Space, Power, and Reform in Saudi Arabia, which was published by Stanford University in 2014. The book we are discussing today, Western Privilege, Work, Intimacy, and Post-Colonial Hierarchies in Dubai, also just hot out of the press by Stanford University, came out in 2021. It was a very pleasant surprise to me that a very good friend of mine, Jane Kuntz, translated the book from the French original into English. Dr. Legenard is also co-author of with our other guests, Neha Vora and Ahmed Kana, Beyond Expectation, New Interpretations of the Arabian Peninsula, which was published by Cornell University Press in 2020. Professor Neha Vora is Associate Professor of Anthropology in the Department of Anthropology and Sociology at Lafayette College. Her research and teaching interests include migration, citizenship, higher education, South Asian and Muslim diaspora, gender, liberalism, political economy in the States, in the Arabian Peninsula region and the United States. She is the author of this brilliant book, of Impossible Citizens, Dubai's Indian Diaspora, which was published by Duke University Press in 2013, and Teach for Arabia, American University's Liberalism and Transnational Qatar, Stanford University Press in 2018. Her current research focuses on transnational circulations of Indian labor and the role of diasporic networks in producing possibility as well as precarity, paying particular attention to the experiences of high-skilled workers navigating temporary visa regimes. So I should mention that Professor Vora is in our neighborhood, and we are looking forward to one of these days to invite her to come here to Princeton in person, and we'll continue this conversation and conversation about her own work in the near future. Again, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Without further ado, I give the screen to Amelie Le Renard. Amelie?
Yes, hello, thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to present the book and for organizing this conference. And so I would like to present the project of the book first. So that will be the next slide, please. Yes, so the book is basically a post-colonial feminist perspective on Western privilege in Dubai. So how it began when I was doing my PhD fieldwork about the transforming femininities of young Saudi women 15 years ago, I was shocked by the stereotypical discourses many French residents I met there held on Saudi people. And after finishing my PhD, I started working on the statuses, self-identifications, and practices of Western passport holders, first in Saudi Arabia and then in Dubai. During the courses I had followed in Middle East studies also, the statuses of Western passport holders had never been a topic. Despite many of these groups occupying dominant positions in firms and various administrations of the region. So my research started with a willingness to question this status and to make Westerner the object rather than the implicit subject of knowledge. In Dubai, as in many places of the world, having or not having a Western passport produces a clear split. Having one facilitates passage across national borders and represents an important differentiator and ranking criterion within the globalized job market, though how and how much one benefits from it differ, notably depending on one's position in gender, class, and race hierarchies. So the book explores how men and women, white and non-white Western passport holders, inhabit the privileged status of Westerner. One of the aims is also to show how they perceive Dubai's social order differently, depending on their trajectories and how they nevertheless participate in reproducing it. For instance, by implementing salary differentiation when recruiting, or by routinely racializing other inhabitants, described as locals, Arabs, Filipinos, or Indians. So I also work on these racialized categories and the ways in which Westerners use them. So to tell you a bit about methodology first, this book is based, oh, sorry, I would like to come back to the, yes, thank you. So the book is based on 98 interviews with 77 Western passport holders and 21 people who had so-called skilled jobs, but no Western passports. Then I re-interviewed 17 of them several years after our first interview to see what they had done. Also, in the second phase of my field work, I interviewed a lot of French people to deepen the, my thinking of the articulation between Westernness and whiteness on a specific case study. And so, yes, so the book talks a lot about French people, but also of other nationalities. So I will insist on three ideas that I defend in the books, or three questions that I try to answer. So first, how a privilege is constructed through work and intimacy. Second, how whiteness and Westernness interact. And third, can we go beyond the exceptionalist discourse on Dubai and what's the position on Westerners in this discourse and in the production also of this discourse. So, the next, I could have next slide. Thank you very much. So the first aspect is how privilege is constructed through work and intimacy. I analyze Westerners' structural advantages on the job market. So that means the advantages that they have when they arrive, just because they have a Western passport, compared to other employees in the same organizations, and even like the advantages that they have in terms of like migration law that is that makes possible for them to come without a visa and so on. So in general, the reason why people talk about Western passports in Dubai and in the region is because it's a clear split on the job market. And in general, many people say, like, and I also observe that, like, Western passport holders tend to have higher salaries, positions, etc., and better careers. But also, like, it's interesting to analyze how skills on Dubai's job market are constructed as Western, and most people I met legitimized this racialized hierarchy and naturalized it as a consequence of neoliberalism and like competition between different nationalities and difference of living standards and living costs and so on in different regions of the world. So just to give you an example, I will read a quote on next slide. Sorry. Yes. So just to give you an example on these structural advantages. For instance, a woman I met who was an engineer with Libyan nationality, but not working as an engineer in Dubai, since like she had to take a job that was considered as below her skills. Told me she told me Westerners, they even get salary compensation for their pets, and I think it's very significant of the feeling of injustice that goes with the structural advantages that Western passport holders benefit from on the job market in Dubai. And to give you an example of how the skills are essentialized as Western, I would like to quote Mike, who was a US architect. And so he told me the Egyptians don't have the same quality of training. So he was speaking about his direct colleagues, by the way. In the US, to become an architect, you have to pass exams, take courses. It's really very hard. Here, everybody is an architect overnight, just like that. And then Egyptians hide things. They're not straightforward about things. They never want to take responsibility for decision making. I've actually worked with Jordanians and Lebanese too, but I've never really noticed any difference. Egyptians, Jordanians, Lebanese, it was always the same problems with all of them. So it's obviously a very racist comment about his colleagues. What is interesting is also the way in which he uses nationalities, but also aggregates them in larger categories. And like I heard it a lot. So categories such as Arabs, such as locals, such as Indians, that actually is used as a racialized category, as we also argued with Neha. So yes, just to give you an idea of this essentialization of skills as Western. So on next slide, I would like, I also analyzed how benefits associated with Western passports differ depending on social positions in terms of gender, class, and race. For instance, the people who had the best contracts with very advantageous packages, including, I don't know, like the international schooling for kids and so on. So what was called family package were in general white men coming from middle and upper classes, especially like among French people, that was the case, and other like people with other trajectories were also relatively privileged, but they did not have the access to the same benefits. So in general, like for instance, among French people, there was a category of people who migrated as single, like not with family members. And they were very, like many of them were doing like very rapid local careers, but there were also, there was a lot of precarity, in fact, in these careers, and they could not come back, for instance, to their home country. And so that was very interesting to observe. And they did not have the same levels of salaries than like really older white men on expatriate contracts. So also the structural advantages also go with constraining norms regarding what is Westerness, and Westerners are expected to perform a stereotypical Westerness, which implies a specific bodily and emotional work. And so this is the subject of a chapter of the book. And so it's also a stereotypical Westerness that is most often associated with whiteness, and goes with specific ways to speak, to present oneself, and so on. And also binary gender identities that are performed in the job market. So on next slide, please. Beside professional aspects, Western distinction lies on specific forms of heteronormativity. Dubai's biopolitics differentiates migrants' intimacies. So in the book, I really wanted to analyze both work and intimacy, and the way in which a category of among like Western passport holders, like the most privileged category among them, the people who come as couples and as families, very often present the city as children friendly and so on, child friendly and family friendly, and they live actually with domestic workers who are not allowed to bring their own children to Dubai. So it's a very interesting configuration to think of also, yeah, the biopolitics and how it produces different, how it produces hierarchical intimacies and intimate lives. So like one interviewee who told me, if we hadn't been here, we never would have had a third child, which I think is significant. So on next slide, yeah, and so one of the things is that the people I met really identified with heteronormative imaginaries of Westerness, and I analyzed both how it was the case for Western white upper class couples who identified with gender inequality and women's emancipation, in contrast with others that were represented as sexist, oppressed, and as frustrated sexual predators. And on the other hand, how single Westerners also associated authentic love with the West and Westerners, in contrast with Dubai's so-called materialism and superficiality. So intimacy also played an important role in the imaginary of Westerness. So then I'd like to talk a little bit about a second idea on next slide, about how whiteness and Westerness interact. So the book talks about how white and non-white Western residents embody privilege depending on their trajectories and experiences of racialization. Dubai's promise of inclusion is limited and precarious for Dubai's non-white Western residents. So, and this is especially on the medium term. Actually, when I interviewed people a few years after the first interview, I found out that many people felt constrained to stay in Dubai because they felt that they could not go back to their home societies where they would be discriminated against. And yeah, so it was interesting to study these medium-term trajectories. But many still experienced Dubai, like when I did at least the first interview, they still experienced Dubai as emancipatory compared to their home societies. And among French people of color I interviewed, several described their migration to Dubai as constrained, to some extent, given the discriminations and oppression they had experienced in France. They tended to compare Dubai and France rather than demonize Dubai and idealize France, as many white interviewees did. So the trajectories also impacted the perception of Dubai's social order and of Western societies or home Western societies' social orders. So on next slide, I will give you a few examples of these perceptions. So for instance, Linda, a manager of French nationality, who talked to me about the tolerance in Dubai. And so this is a discourse that came back a lot in the context of the whole discourse about the fight against terrorism, especially in France. When I was doing this interview, it was in 2015. And so some people told me that they had the feeling that they were really like safe in Dubai compared to France, where they would face Islamophobia in this context. It was also interesting to analyze intergenerational trajectories of people who felt that their parents left their home countries to have a better life in France, and that they had to leave France to have a better life in Dubai. So these intergenerational trajectories of migration. Because I think I've been a bit too long, on next slide, I would like just to give you a few insights about how this book relates to the exceptionalist discourse on Dubai. So first finding was that the exceptionalist discourse describing Dubai as an exceptionally unfair social order is situated. So very often, like for instance, the white interviewees from upper and middle classes that had the most privileged positions in Dubai, and that had also power in Dubai, you know, to reproduce this social order, were those who described the Dubai as an exceptionally unfair place, with more exploitation, with more racism, with more sexism, etc. And other people had left their home countries because of racism, and so they did not have this same discourse. And I also analyzed a lot of, you know, discourse justifying, for instance, the employment of a nanny as saving her from bad so-called Arab or local employers. So these were also discourses that were present, especially among middle and upper class white interviewees. I think Dubai is a very interesting case to think of neoliberalism and like elites in Dubai are very diverse. So I think that's also why many people, for instance, many French people of color experienced it as emancipatory compared to France. But there's also specific forms of structural racism and specific ways to reproduce it, and it's a very unequal society, of course. And so how like people also distinguish themselves from other groups, from people from southern societies and so on, was very interesting to analyze. So it's also, I think, a very interesting place to talk about global racial capitalism and this. So we also worked on this concept with Neha. I did not use it in the book, but I think that the book also shows how Dubai's government and Dubai's organizations use whiteness and Westernness and how they essentialize it on the job market to produce the image of the city. And so that also has consequences, like this branding of whiteness and Westernness has consequences on like what it means to be employed because of this specific of this essentialization and so on, what it means to be employed in order to perform, a stereotypical image of Westernness as professionalism, etc., and how people inhabit this status. And so the book shows that Westerners are not outsiders and are also stakeholders in Dubai's society, that they have power, that even if they do identify as outsiders, they are not, in fact, outsiders. And so I hope it's also it participates in a post-colonial and reflexive turn in studies of the Arabian Peninsula. So I will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Of course, this is there is so much more in the book that obviously in this short period of time we can't cover it all, but I think that was very helpful to set the mood for a conversation about the book, and I invite Professor Vora to offer her reading of the book.
Thank you so much for having me. I have collaborated with Amelie in the past and more recently also, and have had the opportunity to learn from her work. So this is just a really wonderful opportunity to engage with her new text. So I think that this book, rereading it again over the last couple of days, I find it to be even more profound than the first time I read over it. It's an incredibly important intervention into Arabian Peninsula studies. As Amelie mentions in the book, there's not much work that looks at Westerners and Western privilege as a structuring principle of Dubai society. And this is the first book-length ethnography that I know of that considers Westerners in the Gulf and their experiences. One thing she does that I find very useful here is she delinks and denaturalizes Western and white and explores how these categories are both localized in Dubai and reassembled in a multinational post-colonial city. It's refreshing and important to think about race from a post-colonial and transnational perspective. I find often that US race and ethnic studies tends to have trouble abandoning American exceptionalism and effectively locating US racial categories within broader networks of colonial history and US empire. And so this is a very important text, I think, for people who are studying race and ethnicity in general. And this is also a feminist post-colonial analysis. Gender and sexuality are central to the story that Amelie is telling here, and to the way that social hierarchy gets constructed. She looks at the workplaces, domestic life, leisure, and forms of intimacy as interconnected sites through which normative understandings of gender, race, class, and sexuality are produced. I think the thing the book does that does very well is it successfully challenges many of the naturalized justifications for inequity in Dubai's workplaces, such as supply and demand, or the idea that, oh, nationalities are paid differently because in the home country, this is what the money is worth, or the idea that immigrants are outsiders to society who do not spend in Dubai or impact its social fabric. It explores how Westerners who find themselves in more privileged positions than they were in their home country organize their domestic and leisure lives in Dubai by reproducing notions of their superiority and difference from Emiratis and non-Western immigrants, while hardening their self-perception of colorblindness, gender equality, and liberal subjectivity. She goes into how Western privilege is constructed within workplaces at a very granular level, and I found this to be very illuminating. We often talk, at least even in my work, I talk about Western privilege, like this is how social hierarchies work in Dubai, this is how they work in the workplace, but not so much in terms of, well, how have Westerners been part of the production of these hierarchies, and how are they actually reproducing them constantly. She looks at the colonial history of tethering the idea of skills to Western knowledge and people, and the difference between, she looks at that history, and then she looks at the contemporary, the difference between expat contracts, which come with higher salaries and very generous benefits, and local contracts, which usually go to non-Westerners, but not always. She looks at the role of Western hiring managers and other executives in reproducing this hierarchical system. And I think we can put consultants in there too. That would be a whole other area to research. And I think some people have done this research, but not through the lens of race and coloniality. She also looks at horizontal segmentation, where nationalities are kept segregated in the workplace in different areas like IT or marketing, based on national and racial stereotypes. And that's something that we see that people have spoken about in low wage labor, in migrant labor camps and things like that, but not so much in this kind of like white collar work, right? So that this might also be something to explore in terms of what does that do in terms of a collective sort of identity of being an employee. The focus on the domestic is equally important to social hierarchy in Dubai, and this is not something that many people explore. It adds an important layer to this analysis. Amelie explores how patriarchal nuclear family structures are part of the performance and privilege of white Westernness and are sustained by the biopolitical regime of the state and by corporations that provide benefits with the expectation that wives are trailing spouses who do not work in the labor force. So these regimes are prescribing who gets to have a sanctioned sexual subjectivity at all. For example, if you are a low wage construction worker, you live in quote unquote bachelor housing, regardless of your marital status, there is a presumption there that you are not a sexual subject. Domestic workers, as Amelie just mentioned, cannot bring their children with them. Lower middle class families, lower middle class workers can't bring their spouses or their children. On the other hand, there's a encouragement of a patriarchal family structure for Westerners. So white Western wives especially are expected not to work. When I was doing my research ages ago in Dubai, there was this term called Jumeirah Janes, which is like ladies who lunch, right? And even if you look at the cover of the book, this is one of the wealthy newer suburbs in Dubai. I think it's the Greens. And this is the kind of like lifestyle that's being represented here. that the lifestyle that Amelie's talking about. I think this captures it very well. So they're expected instead to be in charge of employing domestic workers, organizing school and leisure activities for children, and they also participate in these larger self-segregated social groups. So this is fundamental to the social reproduction of Westernness, and it's important to look at this side by side and connected with workplace practices. So all of this is going on. Westerners, especially white Westerners, are kind of at the top of the food chain here, right? But despite this kind of structure and the recognition of this structure, white French nationals claim gender equity in their families as a way to set themselves apart from Emiratis and non-Western immigrants. Other claims that they use to distance themselves from Dubai's illiberal social hierarchy and which hardens their liberal subjectivity, were that they treated their domestic workers better than Emiratis did, which Amelie just mentioned, that they were less racist, and that Dubai was superficial, a caste system, etc. These all imply that they are not complicit in maintaining this caste system. And Amelie does a brilliant job in showing that this is patently false. She also talks about how there's pressure to perform normative Westernness as it is tethered to Dubai's own branding. So dressing well, being fit and thin, conforming to stereotypical gender norms, socializing in the best venues, being seen, being on Instagram, all of those things are part of the spectacle of brand Dubai, and Westerners are aware of this, and it requires a great deal of emotional and bodily labor. By delinking Westernness, whiteness, and class, we are also able to see the lives of those who precariously get to occupy the status of Westerner, either because they work on local contracts and cannot afford the lavish lifestyles of the normative Westerner, or because they are not white, or because they are single and navigating the heteronormative spaces of Dubai's nightlife scene. The last chapter of the book is probably the most illuminating, and especially resonated with me because it actually reflects my own experiences that I had to work through while I was doing fieldwork. She considers the experiences of non-white Westerners who, despite not having access to as many privileges as their white compatriots, do have privileged positions. And they also prefer Dubai over France, which for them is a site of racial intolerance. These narratives go far, I think, in undercutting the liberal mythologies of the West and of France that her white interlocutors were steeped in. These folks describe workplace discrimination, unequal pay, Islamophobia, all as part of the everyday lives of people of color in France. And they found comfort and safety and more religious freedom in some cases in a multiracial Muslim city like Dubai. These narratives, I think, should challenge us to move beyond the Arabian Peninsula context and unpack some of the naturalized categorizations through which we label different parts of the world, such as liberal and illiberal, democratic and authoritarian, progressive and oppressive. These narratives in this chapter were almost identical to what faculty of color in Doha's Education City told me when I was doing research there about their experiences teaching and living in Qatar versus the US. So to get us started, I just have a couple of questions, unless you want to move to audience questions.
And let's hear your questions and then we'll move on to audience questions.
Maybe I'll just ask one then, because okay. I can also. So I think the one that I'm the most interested in, Amelie, is what the reception of the book has been like in France, because the book's coming out at a moment of first this rise in state-sanctioned Islamophobia, right? And then also this assault on critical race theory, which we're also dealing with here. And so I'm wondering how that conversation is playing out. The book has now been circulating in France for a couple of years, and now it's circulating in the US. I wanted to get a sense of how those two audiences have been reacting and what kind of differences you see.
So thank you very much, Neha, for your comment and for your very kind comments on the book. It's very good for me to hear. Thank you. And about the reception, I mean, I think there's really a new generation of scholars working on race in France. So some people are interested. Then also as I think in the US, people are very French centered. So the fact that it's about Dubai makes it less attractive than if it talked about France directly, I think. And then the other point is I also got criticism or in reviews, and it's very people have really hard time with whiteness as a concept. Many people have a hard time with whiteness. So yes, so I got comments in reviews or things like that saying that I don't know, that people don't people don't say whiteness, so we should not use a whiteness as a concept to interpret what is happening or things like that. So there's a resistance against this kind of approach, also against the post-colonial approach and so on. So yeah, but I got very good reviews also. So I think right now in France, there's really kind of a huge debate that is a bit conflictual about race. So, and it's good because you really have people who are defending this approach also. And in the US, I don't know yet a lot about how it's, I've presented it a couple of times, but I'm not sure yet. Yeah, I think there is resistance. I think also some people, I don't know, some people working on the Arabian Peninsula for a long time did not really want to, to question their own practices and their own positions and so on. So I think there's also resistance because of this.
That's so amazing. I also have a question which is relevant to this, and I so much like the way the performative aspect of the entire, every chapter has this kind of performative aspect of it. And I see that there is kind of this paradoxical situation that on the one hand, you see this kind of exaggerated performance of heterosexual normativity and reaffirming those kind of roles, stereotypical roles that you so nicely lay out in the book, in the family life and gender roles and so on and so forth. And then on the other side is also, this kind of hedonistic life, nightlife, and in a sense, sort of living in an alternative temporality, that the kind of passing phase of expatriate space, that we are here to have fun, and then after that we go back to our normative life, But in the book there are sort of two separate spaces. I wonder if we see sort of this kind of collision of these spaces, and do we have this kind of very normative, exaggerated normative life, family life, and then singles go out and have this kind of hedonistic life, or they basically exist simultaneously in both spaces?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. So in the book, I decided to, I thought that people could be belonged to two different types or ideal types, in a very schematic way. Of course, it's a continuum, but so you have the people who the white men on expatriate contracts, very advantageous contracts that are for 2 or 4 years, and that have a lot of benefits and family packages and so on, and that come with their spouse, that is most often leaving her job to come to Dubai, and their children. And so they have this is the first category. And then the second category is people that are younger, that come from various backgrounds. Many of them are not white. Many of them come from working class, and very often, like, they do local careers in Dubai. So they arrive in Dubai without a job. They look for a job once in Dubai, and then if they are I don't know, if they understand how to do it in Dubai, then they can have very quick careers and, you know, become change jobs several times and have better and better positions. And yes, these two groups are relatively separate from what I could see, because they are not living in the same neighborhoods, first of all, because you have this organization of the city. Like, some neighborhoods are, at least when I did my research, like, some neighborhoods were forbidden to single people. So you have neighborhoods for families and neighborhoods for everyone, but also because they did not have the same amount of money and salaries and so on. So the families were able to live in in villas and so on, and it was their ideal, you know, like the stereotype of Dubai is like, I have my villa and my swimming pool and my nanny and so on, and I live close to the beach and so on. And so they were living in neighborhoods where all Emirati families live too, and also other upper class families. And they were not, like, these people don't, like, many of them don't stay in Dubai. Many of them see it as a very short period of their lives. They are here for 2 years or for 4 years, and then they will leave. And most of them are white, and they stay among themselves in general, and they have very, very stereotypical discourse on Dubai. While the other group I found, like, among single migrants, like, many of them were not single, actually. They just migrated under the status of single, like, they did not come with a family and so on. They would actually maybe meet more people. That some of them were living in shared flats with people that sometimes did not have a Western passport. So they were also, you know, meeting upper class people in Dubai with other backgrounds and so on. And they were really, like, they really had this very common trajectory in Dubai of, like, enjoying nightlife for 1 or 2 years, and then judging it too superficial and wanting to settle down but not finding somebody and so on. So there was all this discourse about Dubai as superficial and so on. So yes, they had relatively different lifestyles, and also this second group was very mixed. And for instance, when I asked people from, like, I don't know, like people from the first group, white women who came with their husbands and so on, if they knew, for instance, among the French, if I asked them if they knew French people who were Muslim in Dubai, they did not know anybody. Like, they did not socialize with each other. So
fascinating. Let me read to you one of the questions that one of the audience members posed. Thank you for reading this, for this incredible work. I very much enjoyed reading your book. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how academics studying the Gulf have reacted to your line of research on Western privilege and white supremacy, and what that says about the current state of knowledge production in the academy, especially given the exceptionalist and exoticizing frameworks that continue to be employed by academics to describe the region. I don't know if the question is clear to you. Yeah.
Yes, it's very clear.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what to say. I mean, I think it's also an experience that is shared with Neha and Ahmed about the book Beyond Exception. Like, it's yeah, as I said, I think there is resistance because it questions what people used to do, and like it also questions my own training, because I studied Arabic, and my master's was really like, the kind of master's program to become an expert of the Middle East and so on. And so I think you have all this generation of people that have been trained like this. And yes, it's not what is expected from you is not that you study like white and Western people in the Gulf. But it depends. Like, I think I really have mixed reactions. Like, some people are very enthusiastic also. I think it also, I mean, it questions also the kind of objects that we could talk about when we talk about the Arabian Peninsula. It's also it also questions, I think, the gender hierarchies in the field, and the positions that some people get, because some academics are also kind of like expatriate white men moving with their wives and children and so on. So yeah, I think it's not very consensual. But then about the state of the field, I think there's also really a change in the last decade, and we talked about it recently also about the other book, Beyond Exception, that we co-wrote with Neha. But in the last decade, there's really an explosion of like more critical and ethnographic and post-colonial approaches to the Arabian Peninsula. So I think it's participating in a change, in fact.
Very, very interesting.
Can I just jump in there for a second?
Of course.
I have a paper with Ahmed that we then turned into a chapter of the co-written book. And we had both given papers on white privilege among expatriates in the Gulf on a MESA panel. And it was a pretty well-attended MESA panel. And we got so much pushback from white faculty who had taught in the Gulf. I mean, and that was my paper was actually on, Education City. And the sense that, everybody in the Gulf, except for Emiratis, is oppressed because they all are under the kafala system, right? The way of like dismissing complicity, even among academics who are purportedly, trained to study things like this, it runs very deep. There's also, I think, in the Gulf, more so than in other places, a lot of crossover between academia and consultancy. So there's a lot of these like older generation colleagues who are making like good money off of like consulting with governments and like helping them to actually do the work of statecraft, right? So I think that also creates some tension to get called out on these kinds of things and making these like really, because even as a professor, if you go if there was a Princeton in Dubai, those folks would make 30% more than you. They would have all these benefits packages. You would have the expat package, all of that. People don't really want to talk about those differences, right? Because we're all supposed to be Marxists and not care about money. So that I think you see a lot of that playing out. But this younger generation, and especially graduate students, is doing like absolutely amazing work on this kind of stuff.
Wonderful. So is it possible to be Marxist and care about money? I'm just, no, of course. A question from one of our audience members who have read, who has read your, the French version of your book. And the question is about the distinctions between the experiences of homosexual and heterosexual Westerners in Dubai. Do you see any kind of distinctions there, that whether or not these experiences of, because you also talk a lot about intimacy there, and so there's another question about intimacy there as well, that can you talk a little bit about distinctions between heterosexual and homosexual life experiences in Dubai among the expatriate community?
Yes. So I did not like, I had only really a few interviewees who define themselves as gay among Western passport holders. And so I think like I cannot really make general claims about this group. But so I analyzed more like the heteronormative discourses of people who define themselves as heterosexual, and the way in which they used this discourse to distance themselves from people they saw as others, you know. So so for instance, like the fact that they identified with, for instance, the right masculinity as compared to, you know, sexist masculinity of Emiratis and deviant masculinities of migrant workers. So this is the kind of discourse that I heard, or like equal relations, equal heterosexual relations of like between in Western couples, as opposed to, you know, inequality and lack of authenticity in relations between, like, in other heterosexual couples. But yes, so that was a very important point, and actually it contrasted with other discourses that I heard that were from, like, by people who were either not non-Western passport holders, or were Western passport holders but not socialized in Western societies, like people from the Middle East who got a Western passport because they studied abroad in Europe or in North America. And some of them had a discourse about, you know, coming to Dubai in order to be able to have a lifestyle that does not conform with social expectations, in terms of, you know, you have to have a family and get married and bring up children and so on. So I think like some people are migrating to Dubai also to have a life that is not conforming with dominant norms, you know. But most of the people I met were not socialized in Western societies, and the people that I met and that were socialized in Western societies had very heteronormative discourses in general, except for a few people that were not defining themselves as heterosexual. So
thank you so much. There are so many other questions. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, but I encourage you to send your questions to Dr. Le Renard and have that conversation going after this meeting. And again, I would like to thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and Professor Vora for accepting to discuss the book with us. And again, the book is Western Privilege, And thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. This is a wonderful book, and I encourage our audiences to read the book and raise those questions for Dr. Renard later. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.